Would you say, would you agree with Nietzsche when he says Socrates was a man of resentiment because he came
No.
from a humble family and
No,
he
no,
resented the noble
no,
nobility?
no, I don't think so.
But you know
I
that
think
you
that's
know
a
that Nietzsche's.
caricature.
Okay, all right.
I think that's a politically motivated caricature.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to. Well, he is attacking the image of Socrates in the culture, in his culture.
But not
And
Socrates
so
himself.
No, I don't think the historical Socrates. Who knows what the historical Socrates? I mean, there are all kinds of studies, and
Yeah, we don't have many sources other than
we
Plato's,
have
Xenophon,
Plato's and Aristophanes, and the later doxographical tradition, but which was transmission. And there's another aspect of the whole thing, and that is where the transmission differs very completely from the original set in ancient Greece. You see, philosophy, I think, was a praxis. What counted was the practical doing, what you did, right? Not what you. The doctrines were secondary to the praxis, to the ascesis, to the praxis. Right? Now, they all had a praxis, physical and spiritual. Plato was a wrestler. The name Platon is a wrestling name, right? The chubby one, the broad-shouldered one.
Yeah.
And Socrates was a wrestler, frequented constantly the gymnasia. Right?
Right.
So, but they also had a kind of they understood philosophy as a way of life.
It's hard to talk about Nietzsche these days because it just sounds juvenile. It's because it's the first philosopher most young guys get into, and then they have really sort of naive interpretation and it's cringe stuff the way they talk about it. So I want to start by saying this is not that. I've not just started reading them and I'm going to do all that. I'm not the Ubermensch, calm down. Okay, well I'm going. I have to go down like Zarathustra first.
You can be the semi-mensch.
I've got a semi-mensch. So I'm on my third cycle of him now, I think. So I got into him when I was young, like that, in my 20s, after reading Robert Anton Wilson. And, so I got through the naive Nietzsche phase then. And then I left it for a year, I was always reading other things and stuff. And then I came back to him in my 30s and read I just said, no, it can't be that. There must be some kind of other path or whatever. And then, so I go into that, and I was doing different practices and stuff that were related to different mystical things and a mishmash of different things I was trying, and everything from body work to like really abstract meditations so then I rejected him, and then recently I came back to him again. So now people don't want to hear it. A lot of people don't want to hear it, but he is the philosopher for this time, whether we like it or not. You have to grapple with him, whether you like him or agree with him or not. And this time I've come back to him in a very different way, though. It's like I'm more interested in how he was approaching practices and how his philosophy was about a practice for people to transform themselves. And, sidestepping a lot of all the boring political arguments related to him and other things. And I discovered this amazing book that I hadn't heard of before called Shaping the Future by this Austrian guy called Horst Hatter. Shaping the Future, Nietzsche's Therapeutic Teaching for... Oh no, is this the one? No, it's a different book. Sorry, that's the wrong subtitle. Shaping the Future, Nietzsche's New Regime of the Soul and its ascetic practices. It's brilliant. So if anyone likes Christopher Hyatt stuff, if you read this book by this Austrian professor, it's like he's like a polite professor version of Hyatt. It's very different style, but the same basic idea, and then both of them are obviously influenced by Nietzsche. And it's about the practices. So obviously Christopher Hyatt's whole thing was giving people practices to transform themselves, to get out of to overcome themselves, to use Nietzsche's phrase, and to free their brains from their conditioning, their habits, their automated impulses and stuff. Gurdjieff obviously is another guy who's doing this too. Don't know if he was read Nietzsche or not, probably did. Don't know. But anyway, so this guy, I found it really good because this book, he has the approach to Nietzsche that he talks about. He's going through his notebooks and stuff, and Nietzsche a lot in letters and notebooks. It's clear that he wants to create his own philosophical school, similar to like Plato and the Academy and Aristotle and Epicurus and the Stoics and all these guys. Nietzsche's obviously it's clear he's wanting to do that, and there's many quotes in the book, and he just can't find any people, and then he just sort of gets distraught later on and then gives up. When you realize this is, and he says explicitly he's trying to start a school, it's not just like guessing. So when you look at the things Nietzsche was doing then in terms of this, and the guy goes through it in the book, you'll see a lot of the things he was doing were actually philosophical practices. The solitude stuff. You're getting away from all the things that make you react and like all your automatic behaviors and the people and stuff. And it's just meant to be a temporary phase. And then you find real friends. You develop real friendships from after your solitude when you've got away from people. And, this is clear in the internet. You have to get away from all of the noise if you're going to think straight, just to bring it down to earth. So that was just one of Nietzsche's things. And then there's other themes the guy in this book goes into. But basically it's seeing philosophers, and Nietzsche is one of them, as practitioners. It's about practices, transforming yourself, or as this Austrian guy says, self-shaping. He says he prefers self-shaping and self-cultivation instead of self-creation, which makes sense because it's more accurate. Obviously you don't create yourself, but you can cultivate yourself and shape yourself. And he uses Nietzsche and says Nietzsche's he's doing the same thing as Plato, even though he criticizes Plato a lot for different reasons. Although it's more Platonism Nietzsche's criticizing than Plato himself. And all these guys is about practices for a small group of people who are interested in these things. It's not about, and then those small group of people then influence the culture, either directly as leaders, like everyone knows Aristotle and Alexander the Great, or they do it indirectly through, changing the culture, giving new ideas, new ways of being, ways of living. And then at different times, you'll get the philosopher in his school would be like Epicurus, where he has the secret garden and they're all in the garden and they kind of withdraw from life. But in this book, Shaping the Future, he seems to argue that Nietzsche's like a combination of Plato and Epicurus, where he wants people need to withdraw and do all these practices on themselves, working on themselves first, and then later they can go back to changing the society and things, which Plato was trying to do directly. And even was trying to mentor a tyrant at one point. I don't think it ended well. But anyway, so I think he sees Nietzsche as more, he's like he uses the phrase a therapist of culture, and that's the role of a philosopher, and that Nietzsche he saw philosophy as a way to health, but like health in the grand sense of health, health in every aspect of life and flourishing, basically. So just to finish, he sees Nietzsche as basically not being against all the old guys, which seems like when the first time you read Nietzsche, he hates Socrates, hates Plato, he's totally different, he's get rid of all that and move on to a new thing. And he hates Christianity and he wants to move on to a new thing. But when you look at it in terms of the practices he's doing and the mindset, it's exactly the same idea with the philosophical schools. It's practices, techniques, self-transformation, and you change the culture that way. And the same thing would apply to a lot of all especially the earlier Christian practices and things like that as well. So it's really all the same category of organization, let's call it. And then someone like Christopher Hyatt was obviously doing this towards the end, where he was had groups and students and stuff, and he was trying to set up some kind of institute towards the end and things. It's all the same idea. It's like a practical school of philosophy that has real techniques that actually change you at a deep level. And somewhere that people can go that gets out of normal life for a while to learn, and then the idea they would go back to normal life and make it better for them and other people.
Of course, this is an idea as old as time, isn't it? From the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, I spoke to Nick Thatcher once in a conversation, and he said that Hyatt was deeply, deeply influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche. And I think that's very, very clear in his writing, as edgelord and cringe as it can be, perhaps, to some people's sensibilities. It's pretty obviously in there, and it kind of, I like to think that he probably, well, like this gentleman that you're speaking about now, more than anyone really did the work to push that in that direction, probably more than anyone I'm aware of, actually. I don't think there's really many people that have picked up on this. And it takes me back just to your initial comments on the way that Nietzsche is often taken. And I find in my survey of the landscape that it tends to be, the content that you can get tends to be very much spoken word analysis of passages, long podcasts on what this or that meant, which is fine. It has its place. And then on the other hand, you have the purely political angle, which in probably what I would consider to be a highly politicized culture, and really a rather pathetic one too, he seems to be taken in purely political terms. Was Nietzsche left wing or was he right wing? As if these contemporary labels, I think, are hugely applicable, at least in the modern world. And then, of course, the other element you see is the genetics or eugenic or breeding element. And of course, the war element. So the explicit reference to martial violence that he's often invoked to justify or whatever else. I think all this stuff is fine. I think it's interesting and it's valid, a lot of it. But at the same time, what really struck me is when I first read him, and I was getting into yoga and meditation and various other things, is what really struck me is how many passages in his books reference the idea of having drives and the physiology, and how physiology shapes thought, how physiology shapes basically experience. It shapes entire epochs of human political and social organization, according to him. And it's just funny, there's always been a dearth of material other than, people like Hyatt and this gentleman, which I didn't know about until you pointed him out to me. And of course, when you go to his channel and you take a look, there's 900 views or 400 views after 10 years, So it just goes to show how little people have thought about Nietzsche in these terms. But when I read his books, and even to this day, I continuously quote him in my Substack, because every time you read a book, it could be Daybreak or, the earlier texts or Beyond Good and Evil, there are just constant references to the physiology and drives in particular. And there's one quote I like in Daybreak, which is one of my favorites. He talks about the goal of human beings needs to be becoming the gardener of drives. And of course, the reference to drives is what Freud took. And we see this in, psychoanalytical theory and language from Freud. But it's so explicitly stated in his work that I struggle to understand why no one ever talks about it. And then when we maybe put a show out or do some tweets on it, there's just zero interest. But as far as I can see, it is actually almost the most important part of his work. It wasn't just, look, everyone's got to be a fascist or a warrior or whatever it is. It seems like he's calling for an actual mastery of the human physiology and a new polis, a new way of being. And there is just very, very little work that has been done in this regard. And when I read, it's Horst, isn't it? I forget his last name.
Horst Hatter.
Hatter. Dr.
Hatter.
Hatter's work.
Hutt.
Yeah, sure. I was blown away at how good his interpretation is. And I've not finished his books because I'm a corporate slave, but I am getting through them and I'm just really enjoying it. And it's refreshing to see someone who is so clearly, because for all Hyatt's work, he never, I would say, explicitly referenced Nietzsche like this in this much detail. But the way this guy is justifying his position, he's talking about ascetic practices in the terms that I've just outlined, in terms of, cultivating the physiology in the self and cultivating culture in this way. It's very refreshing to see. And it would be good if he got more acknowledgement than he does currently. So thank you for introducing him to me. But it's been a constant frustration of mine online that you just cannot get people to consider Nietzsche from this angle. And as far as people will go, it's going to be, get on the Ray Peat sugar diet because that'll make you into the Ubermensch or something, or go to the gym. But it's so much deeper than that. And it's even deeper in Nietzsche's work. And it's really got to be explored more, in my opinion. And this text does a great job of it.
I think he's not, people, like you're saying, no one's really that interested in it. It's because it's Nietzsche and Hyatt also actually are combining two things that usually don't go together. They're combining like a hardcore absolute acceptance of biology, animals on a planet with everything that entails. They're basically just mostly conditioning and automatic processes mostly. So there's lots of scientists, materialists, reductionists would agree with that side of it, and it's all just like there's a lot of chance and there's a lot of like bad things and all that stuff. So you'll get those guys who'll agree with it, and then the opposite, you'll get people who are like either woo-woo spiritualists or they're like, religious or just very sort of abstracted intellectuals or whatever. They're like out of touch with the other side. So you don't normally get, there's not that many people who hold both of them together, like that, who hold the possibility for transcendence, but it's within the biological planetary framework. It's not out there, it's here now, but it's like you really can transcend your current nature and as this guy says, self-shaping, which I like. You can shape yourself, you can cultivate yourself, you can overcome yourself. Hyatt, of course, was putting it into neuroscientific terms by the end, and it's like really hard about, if you're not changing the brain, you're not changing anything. Very easy for somebody to hear that and think we're just reducing it to science, materialism and brain scans, and it's like that. Unless it's in numbers, it doesn't count. We're not saying that. But we're also not saying you can just dream about it and imagine you're changing yourself, because if you're really changing yourself in terms of how your mental experience and your energetic experiences are, there must be brain change along with that, So we're like, again, this is, most people fall in one end or the other. They'll be woo-woo or reductionist. There's not many people who can hold both together at the same time. Nietzsche does, he's clearly a religious thinker in a way, but at the same time, he's like really interested in physiology. And there's one of his unpublished notes somewhere he's talking about that's all he reads now is physiology and medicine and natural sciences. He's not bothering about all the other stuff at the moment. So I think that's why there's not many people, because it's unusual to have both. Hyatt has a phrase in the Undoing Yourself book years ago, which I use with caution, and he calls it spiritual biology, which is a nice phrase, but it's kind of hard to use the connotations of it. But it gets the idea across that you're accepting the biology side of it, but also there's a spiritual side to it. But you can't have one without the other. And a lot of Nietzsche's thing and Zarathustra seems to be that. It's like is basically trying to come back down to earth with the transcendence, but then maintain the possibility of transcendence now that you come back down to earth as an animal and all the rest of it. It's subtle, and it only makes sense in terms of working on yourself, transforming yourself. It's only if you've ever tried to actually overcome patterns of thought you've had and you manage to break through them by doing weird practices, whether it's breathing practices or movement stuff or hardcore exercise or things like that, where you really try to break through to a different way of perceiving and feeling reality. only when you've done that, then you can make sense of this stuff. Oh, it's actually possible, but it's within the context of this body, this planet. But it's not just that, you know? So, and the Horst Tatter does a good service of explaining. He doesn't go into it quite the way we're saying it, but he actually does say stuff like that in his videos. The couple of videos online we can maybe link to with this podcast at some point, where he talks about, humans having first nature, which is, first nature and second nature. So first nature is biology, genetics, those things. And second nature is culture. So you have all this culture is kind of shaping and controlling and trying to calm down the worst parts of the first nature and to amplify the good parts of first nature. And then he would classify all these kind of practices, this aesthetic practices and philosophical practices and psychophysical practices. He would classify them as part of the second nature, trying to control and guide and make better first nature. I think probably it's better to call those kind of practices third nature, because they grow out of a certain culture, and then people within that culture going, there's some problems with this, and then they start working on themselves and looking for schools and looking for techniques to work on themselves. I think we should really call that third nature, maybe. Anyway, semantics, but it makes it more clear. So yeah, so Horst Tatter is good for putting this whole thing in a philosophical context. If anyone's read Pierre Hadot, the French guy who wrote a book called Philosophy as a Way of Life about spiritual exercises, which is what we're talking about here, Horst Tatter is basically just applying that idea. So like Pierre Hadot applies that to all the ancient philosophers, saying that it was about practices, not about doctrines. I have always agreed with this, actually. And modern, they just got obsessed with words and doctrines and who said what, rather than how can I use these ideas as tools to change myself, which is the only thing I've actually cared about. So Horst Tatter basically is applying that theory of actually insight of Pierre Hadot's into the ancient philosophers. He's applying that to Nietzsche. That's basically the best way to explain that. So that's another book people can read, Philosophy as a Way of Life, Pierre Hadot. Shaping the Future by Horst Tatter. And also, there's another one related to this we maybe talk about later by Graham Parks called Composing the Soul. It's about Nietzsche's psychology. It's interesting as well. So all these are a totally different way of looking at Nietzsche and putting him into a different context. And really, he's not really that different from the other people. And he's grappling with the same ideas, and the practices work. You can use solitude as a practice, or you can be a loner and use it as cope. So there's, a fine line. You'll have to, are you telling the truth by saying you're just in solitude as spiritual training, or are you really, is that just cope? There's many different ways you can, many different practices. It can be martial arts. It can be, whatever helps you self-over.
Yeah, well said. Well, I've seen this split in the discourse for a number of years, and there's this either or mentality. And Nietzsche, I suppose you could say, was not keen on life denial and life denying philosophies like Christianity, and obviously he's quite vitriolic against it. And Buddhism, I think he's slightly more conciliatory towards, but still essentially sees it as a somewhat life-denying venture, although a more noble one. There is an aphorism on it. I forget, maybe in Daybreak. I don't recall exactly. I think the split is an interesting one, because when you see this brought up in the general discourse, and interestingly, Christians are against ascetic practices as well. So a lot of the Nietzscheans and Christians online and elsewhere kind of coalesce, interestingly, into having the same point of view about all these things. But you often see people criticize meditation. I'm just using the big things as an example, and similar practices. You could say yogic practices or breath work or just stuff like that. Sort of stuff we talk about. And they may say that, well, if you go on a meditation retreat, well, that's life denying because you're trying to, subvert the will to life and, the will to power, and therefore you shouldn't do things like that because it's against organic biological expression, and it aims to blunt it or to try and get rid of it in a naive kind of venture to try and get rid of it. And I think part of the complication then comes on, Nietzsche absolutely did say stuff like that. And so then how do some of these ascetic practices that you've been referencing, how do you then fit that into a pro-life or a pro samsara existence? And it's absolutely true that from a philosophical and doctrinal point of view, that if you look at something like Christianity or Islam or Buddhism, it does have somewhat a negative view of life and the universe and the human body to differing extents, depending on which religion or what philosophy you're looking at. But at the same time, when you take all that noise away and you just don't think about these big ideas that are behind these philosophies so much, and you just look at what the practices are, what they do to your body, and how you feel when you do them, I think that all of these ascetic practices can very easily be channeled into a Nietzschean assist and to help people become the gardener of drives, because our ability to do that just through thinking and reading and talking is very limited. So you do need help. And my contention is, this is my theory, tell me if you agree or not, but practices that are anti-natural in the sense that when you do them, you don't want to do them because the body wants to just do what it's doing and it doesn't want you to interfere with what it's doing. So they cause some degree of pain to do them, and they require conscious control. Things like meditation, things like, even working out or the various yogas or, whatever it is. Although these things have been contextualized in some historical philosophies, such as Buddhism, such as Vedanta, such as Christianity, there is no particular reason why the tool needs to be defined by that framework. And when you read some of the aphorisms that I've referenced already, you think to yourself, well, how is it that I can achieve this? How can I become a gardener of these biological drives, these drives that have their own wills almost? He seems to be saying that these drives, you may have a drive to do this, to go and work out, then you have a drive to go and get drunk, and they could be equally as powerful. And how is it that someone can obtain some degree of higher mastery over all of these things? And it's always been funny to me, but actually in these religions, these ascetic practices are quite literally exactly designed for that purpose. That's basically why human beings came up with the tool. So I think that this new discourse needs to get rid of this split, because there is no split between these tools. This is what they are, and that's how you and I always talk about them as tools, that they can absolutely be used in a pro-life, pro-organic context, and obviously in a context of self-mastery. And if you wish, you can then take away the quote-unquote life negative context that they currently exist in. As I always say to people, when I do, and no doubt people have their own experiences like this, but when I do yoga in the morning, or when I do meditation, even for 10 days straight, I don't feel life negative. I feel life positive. So the question is, how do you square that away? How do I say, well, right now, my muscles and my tissues feel like they're on fire, but someone online is telling me that I'm denying life? It's never made sense to me. And the people I think that engage in this dichotomy or this argument or this either-or argument are betraying the fact that they have little or no experience with these things. Because if you did have experience with these things, with the effects that it gives you, the self-control that it gives you, the control of your drives, the control of emotions, like the ability to regulate yourself in ways you didn't think possible, the ability to, ironically, overcome the animalistic reactivity of the organic, but at the same time, you're also engaging deeply with it on a deeper level than you perhaps ever have before. So there is some kind of paradox in that when you do talk about it. So I do understand why people get confused by it, but really, it's not something, in my opinion, how people say literally no contradiction. I've always been a literally no contradiction guy when it comes to this. I don't think there is a contradiction. I think they're tools. I think they're all very useful tools. And some may work for you, some may not work for you. You just use them like that. And I think that they can very easily, a lot of these things can very easily be put into the context of a philosophy of life, which is, I think, what he's getting at ultimately, and where that split probably originally comes from. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. It's just something that I've always noticed people getting into arguments about. And
Yeah, it's whether you approach it from the point of you're approaching it in the direction of practices first, not the talk and writing about the practice, if you know what I mean. Although obviously you only discover the practices by reading about them or finding about, words lead you to the practices, but then practices become the main thing for some people. So like there's the tool, like I think tool's a good way to describe these things. Tools are instruments. There's the tool and then there's the manual that comes with the tool, the culture and all the other ideas around it. A lot of the stuff in the manual you don't need to use the tool. So there'll be part of the manual is the practical step 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then there's a lot of other kind of theories and models and stuff wrapped up with the tool. Some of them it's really like hard to separate the tool from the manual. Some of them it's a lot easier. Some of them don't work as well if you separate them too much from the manual. Some of them work better if you separate them from the manual. A lot of the stuff that's in the manual, like a lot of the concepts often and the beliefs and all that go with that culture around that practice. Sometimes they were just to solve problems in that culture at that time. And we don't have that culture or those problems in that way now, and you don't need them. So I think we're just at the time where we can, we did a podcast a long time ago about tradition. Should you have a tradition and stick to the tradition for your practices, or should you do pick a mix of different traditions? We came to some kind of blend of the two approaches, sort of. Since then, I've kind of leaned more towards the pick and mix than I was during that discussion, but only because of I think that's just fate. We're just condemned to that rather than it being the best thing. You can't choose to not do that because you're just doing pick and mix. Which tradition are you choosing to be traditional about? It's pick and mix again. You can't. You're like it's the toothpaste is out of the tube. However, when you look at Nietzsche from this point of view as an example, he's not the only one of more recent philosophers who has the old kind of mentality. Stein is similar. He was like, gave up his money and went and lived in a hut in the middle of nowhere and stuff. They were doing things, shaping their lives in a certain way that was inseparable from their thinking. And then obviously doing experiments, very experimental kind of thinking. Wittgenstein's doing that. Nietzsche's obviously doing that. He's explicitly talking about how you should make everything an experiment. Philosophy should be experimental, psychology, everything, which I agree with. Hyatt is obviously doing that. He's kind of implementing a lot of these ideas. He's doing it. And in the beginning, he's using more kind of occult techniques, esoteric kind of techniques mixed together of different things from different traditions. And then later, he seems to become more biological and physiological about it. Although he did start as a experimental psychologist, with literally working with rats. So, he's coming from that background anyway, so you can see how he's going to end up in a biologist. Nietzsche gets way more physiological.
And a psychoanalytic background as well.
Oh,
which
yes,
I should
also,
just
yeah.
mention, right? Yeah, sorry.
Exactly. So, in this, I mean, psychoanalysis just comes out of Nietzsche, basically. That's where it came from. Not really referenced properly by Freud. So, like it's all over the place in Nietzsche. And they just, if you approach these guys as practitioners doing practices and you see their thinking as part of the practice, as actually a practice, the thinking, it's not about truths, it's about a practice. And you're like grappling towards truths, but it's not about truth in the same way that a lot of the modern neurotic kind of philosophy seems to think it's about. I think this is just a big general trend anyway, that everybody's fed up with where philosophy was, and it's not doing anything, and it's too abstract and too disembodied, too just not useful,
Too German.
go around in circles. Some of it are too French, some of it as well,
Yeah.
and then some of it too English. There's another type that's too English. So Scottish philosophy is fine, of course.
Of course,
but
Dave.
it's Hume. There's also the common sense guy, So anyway, who else? So yeah, I mean, if you start with the idea of practitioners, it's just a totally different way of thinking, and then you automatically go straight to the idea of a school. You think, okay, so I need to find other people who are thinking like this and want to work on themselves and work with them and help each other, teach each other and stuff like that. It just comes naturally. And
tell me, just quickly while you're on that topic, because you mentioned in the book, he says that Nietzsche wrote letters about trying to form a school or a group or something like this.
Yeah, I'll read
do you
a
have more
quote.
details on that part?
Yeah, hold on, I'll read a quote here. He says, this is from Shaping the Future. He says, Nietzsche remained invested in founding a philosophical school a la Plato and Epicurus from the beginning of his career as a philosophical writer to the very end, when he was in despair about his inability ever to succeed in such an enterprise. And so it's in his letters where he's saying to his friends, we should get together and make our own academy. We should do this, we should do that. And then if you go back and you think about things Nietzsche's saying, he's book for free spirits. He's trying to find free spirits. He's looking for friends. Zarathustra's trying to find, he gives up, try to speak to the multitude, and then he just wants to speak to a few people. And it's clear Nietzsche's doing that. There's more. I can't find one of the specific quotes just now, but he says things like, "Here's one. I'm not sure who he wrote this to. This is Nietzsche. A quote from Nietzsche's one of his notebooks, a letter. He says, "We are then our mutual teachers." Talking to his friend. Our books are our fishing rods, so as to win others for our convent-like artistic fraternity. So he's trying to build a school in this sort of ancient sense, and the books are fishing rods. They're for finding the people. They're like lead magnets, lead generation. The books. And then late in his life, he's like, "There's nobody born yet. It's just me." And that's when he talks about some people only born posthumously.
Okay.
So that's what he's referring to. There's nobody around yet, but you guys will do it when I'm gone, basically.
It's similar today. I mean, I pull my fucking hair out as well, people. It's
hardly anyone. I mean, I reckon these things probably had. I mean, there's a guy, I forget his name now. There's a classicist guy who does a podcast I just discovered recently as well. And he's talking about how Plato, what's his name? Alex Petkas or Petkus, something like this. I can't remember his name. He's talking about how Plato used the dialogues those days were like lead generation. The dialogues went around, were like to be passed around, and they were for getting people for the school, for the academy. It's like he wanted the potential leaders and the sons and all the wealthy and also people with potential and stuff like that to lead them, and that was a way to get the people. And it was like with political intentions with Plato, it was like train people to run the place better, So I think, and Nietzsche was doing something similar. He was just didn't like the way things were, and he's trying to dismantle all the dead beliefs and all the dead ways of doing things and create new ones. And some of the letters he's writing to. There's ones where he writes to a couple of women where he's trying to get them involved and stuff. So I don't know how much that's about the school and how much that's about, chasing chicks. But it's pretty obvious that's what he's doing. Think about it. It's full of it's full of like references to friendship and finding friends and stuff like that. He's clearly, and everyone knows it's a cliche that he's lonely and on his own and stuff a long time. But it seems to be one of Horst Hatter's points is the solitude and the living alone stuff that he recommends was to be a tool to prepare you for real friendships later. It's just then Nietzsche himself couldn't find them. So like the idea was that you withdraw in order to work on yourself, and then you get away from the noise, and then you have a space to work on yourself. Hyatt has a similar idea on the undoing yourself work. He says you need to, there'll be a withdrawal period in the beginning often where people kind of hide away from things as they work on themselves, and then they gradually go back. It's like an incubation kind of thing. So I think that's just, I think that's what Nietzsche was doing. I'll try and find some more actual quotes from his books, but he really does say like explicitly about try to found an academy, and it's both very early, really early. He's saying that to friends, and then later he's referencing it as well.
Yeah.
So it's obviously what he wanted to do, and it makes sense. I mean,
totally. You need solitude. I mean, can you imagine being that guy? Like, you can't have thoughts like that if you're, attending the Reddit meetup in the city. I mean,
Zarathustra's structure, the start is he's in solitude. He's leaving solitude. He's had 10 years where he was perfectly happy on his own. And then he decides that he wants to change the world and tell everybody about his ideas and pass on his wisdom. He tries to do that and they mock him. And then, they might kill him. They're not happy about it and they don't want to hear it. And then he's like, oh, okay, so I'll just need to find a few people and work with them. It's like, it's written there. It's clear. It's like that's the school. He's like making a school in it. That's what he does. It's like a philosophical school with his disciples or whatever. Why would he not really be trying to do this?
Sure. His detractors, of course, whenever you see them of various colors, or they always make him, he was an incel, or he was just lonely and he didn't have a wife. But again, it betrays an ignorance of what ascetic practices require. They do, as you say, require no small degree of alone time, and basically a wife and children, if you have one, probably going to make it extremely difficult to have that.
I mean, they have this in the Eastern stuff as well.
Well, I was going to say,
do this.
Exactly, and a lot of guys, reactionary people today, will look at those morals of those systems, right? And they'll go, oh, well, the reason you can't have a wife in Buddhism is because, if you do it, it's bad karma and you'll go and like get prodded by bamboo sticks, like whatever it is in Buddhist hell. But a lot of these rules have very practical reasons.
That, to me, that's the stuff that's in the manual. Yeah, that's added to the manual for that. For some people, it was just a tool. This guy's better off not chasing women and doing this and staying away from them. For other people, it's better to do that. Hyatt was like of the opinion that you should do that stuff. You should have like lots of sex and relationships and things like that. That was like because otherwise you just end up all taking weird in another way. That's probably psychoanalytic background was influencing that as well. But also it's for some people at a certain time. It's like that might be the right thing for a young, maybe no FAP is good for some young guys to focus them and to develop some discipline and stuff.
No FAP.
But to make it like a lifestyle that lasts forever and all that, then you're just crazy. You're now just thinking the tool is the person. It's like very easy to do this with stuff. It's like the tool, we mistake the tool for a lifestyle, and then you mistake the lifestyle for like a ethical.
Right. You ascribe supernatural causes to it. Everything becomes supernatural and moralistic.
Yeah. It's just tools, and discard them. Some people, they work for some people, not others. Other people need certain things. Often it's the opposite of what you feel most attracted to that you need. Some people will need the real harsh discipline stuff. Some people need less of it because they're too like hustler types, or they're too like totally trapped in. I mean, one of the modern cliches then, it was like the person who's like the status-seeking, successful person, and then one day they just quit and go off and live in the forest, or they go off to go to a Buddhist monastery or something like that. They have to get away from that stuff to even start to do any work on themselves. But it can be the other way too. It can be somebody who's laid back and, a wanderer and that kind of thing, who actually needs to do something that's like ultra disciplined and structured, where they just have to dive in and do the opposite, That wouldn't help the successful person to do that. They were too neurotic about that stuff, so they needed to do something where they're just kind of more surrendering and letting things happen. It just depends on the person, depends on the stage the person's at, and depends often on the age of the person, just general situation, whether there's a fucking war going on in the place where you're trying to do the practices. There's loads of things that impact on it. But
of
like
course,
somebody
one of his
niche
big,
themselves online, so everyone do.
yeah. But I see one of his biggest contributions. This is a thing that I love about him. I think it's probably one of the most useful things in terms of physiology, at least, that he spoke about. These big systems like Buddhism and Christianity in particular, they make neurotic certain drives in the human being that are just natural. So it could be the subversion of sexuality, which I agree with Hyatt, that does cause neurotic symptoms. But actually the truth is, trying to keep any drive down results in, kind of neurotic symptom, what you could call a neurotic symptom. I see one of Nietzsche's biggest contributions was the idea that these moral systems have quite negative impacts on not just individuals, but cultures at large, in that they pathologize certain very important drives. And one of the ones I've been writing about recently is hatred. And of course, you like to make fun of me for this, but fair enough. But it's this pathologized hatred that you see in young boys in particular. And it's one thing with women, but women have a very indirect way of expressing hatred that's less obvious. But for young boys, particularly in the developmental stages of their existence, the current ideology, whatever you want to call that, heavily polices what is quite a natural thing and something that no doubt needs to be constructively channeled. I'm not advocating for just chimping out like some people do. But certainly it doesn't need to be the individual who has this drive doesn't need to be told that they're a bad person for having it and evil and have these objective spooks thrown at them when they express something that is not only quite natural but is extremely powerful. Hatred is extremely powerful when cultivated in a positive way. And the best thing, or one of the best things for me about Nietzsche's whole philosophy, is his freeing up of the human drives from subversive dogmas. And in his case, it was Christianity. In other cases, it can be in Buddhism, it could, it's a little bit different in Buddhism, but if you took it the wrong way, for sure, you would do the same thing. I mean, a lot of Westerners walk around, we're all happy and, enlightened on the outside. And, I don't feel hatred. I don't feel anger. I'm so spiritual. But they absolutely do. And, it just comes out in silly and ridiculous and self-destructive ways very often. But Nietzsche's positive outlook towards these things is, okay, we have them. Moral systems are not a good thing because it means that we try to cover them up, or they get expressed in sadistic and horrible ways, or just silly ways and self-defeating ways more often than not. And that part of the project of shaping the future, I think, is a full, honest appraisal of the human physiology and all the streamings and all the less than flattering elements, including hatred. I personally think it's quite flattering, but many people would say that it's not. Anger, all of these kinds of things, and using them and transmuting them in the individual so the individual becomes greater. And in some sense, instead of being victimized by these drives, then becomes its wrangler or riding upon them, like one rides a horse or something like this. I consider this to be one of his greatest contributions, a true liberating contribution. And people, particularly religious people, I don't think they've fully grasped this. I think a lot of their hatred comes from Nietzsche's apparent immorality or tearing down moral structures. But a lot of these moral structures are really rather ridiculous and silly. And they are so not on a civilizational level, like, degeneracy and all this sort of stuff. That's not really what I mean. What I'm talking about is how these attitudes are held in the human body, in the individual human body. And when you teach someone that a part of themselves is objectively evil and objectively bad, this shapes the body and the way that it acts in a dynamic sense, in a very real and very quite negative way, very often. And I think his project was simply recognizing this and recognizing that you can't just wish these things away. These things are always going to be there. You can't moralize them away. You can't speak them away. They're always going to express themselves. And the project, therefore, needs to be one where we acknowledge what they are. We acknowledge their destructive elements, but we can also acknowledge their positive elements in the work of self-mastery and self-cultivation, using them. And of course, the example of hatred that I invoked, it's quite obvious when you think about it. If you hate your circumstance, then you're motivated then to change it. It's one of the most powerful ways you can change something is by having hatred for something. It doesn't need to be necessarily, this horrible pathological emotion. It can be very destructive, obviously, but then it begins to make sense, I suppose, why this civilization and this society has pathologized hatred above all other human drives, because the last thing they want is a population capable of hate and capable of, therefore, using that as a catalyst for change. And I suppose, just to finish off, this is where ascetic practices are very important, because in the process of socialization of the human infant and the human, I suppose, up to adolescent, it's one thing to say, well, I'm going to teach, my child in a mature way to handle these things in themselves. But of course, mistakes get made and nothing's perfect, and the child can reach wrongful assumptions based on its own conclusions that the parent doesn't necessarily have much to do with. So more work needs to be done after childhood. Even the best childhood, the most reasonable, well thought out, well planned childhood, the individual is not yet complete. And in my opinion, more work needs to be done to integrate the human biology and to create a truly well integrated individual. And I kind of forgot where I was going with this, but I do think that is one of his biggest contributions for me. And it's, again, one of these things that's really not really often spoken about. I rarely hear anyone speak about this, but to me, it's extraordinary because that's almost the biggest thing that he said.
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows Nietzsche's thing about, man is a rope between ape and Superman, or whatever. And, understand that
I think you said it was a rope between, what was it?
A rope over an abyss.
Yeah, that's
and
it.
So everyone knows that, but then they don't actually apply it to now, here as now, this animal in this body on this planet doing its thing now with all these drives and stuff. They don't actually apply it now as in the idea which Nietzsche has, which Horst Hatter says in one of the videos, he says it explicitly, and also Hyatt, obviously, his whole thing about this is that human being is incomplete. It's not a end. It's not done. Being human is something you need to strive and evolve and to keep evolving for, to be fully human. And if you take that idea as not just some abstract philosophy, but as okay, what are you going to do about it now? So you would do things like how to overcome your habits, how to strive to greater ways of understanding and seeing and living in the world. In the East, they call these things like enlightenment and, awakening. But it's like, it's more kind of passive and, like stepping out of action to do those things. Whereas the West, this is like Nietzsche talking about these things, is the Western version of this. It's more about will. And that's why he's also talking about war and violence and stuff. And it's because it's not about, and even the solitude, it's not about just being like hiding from everybody and not moving and stuff like that. It's like, it's this striving for transcendence. And it's just, to me, this, like, it's pretty clear now that I've come back to him properly and I'm going back into Nietzsche, reading him directly again properly for the first time in a while. It's so clear that this is just the Western way of awakening. That's what it is. Obviously, the Greeks and that are doing it, but this is like the modern Northwestern Europe way of doing it when you've got guys like the Greeks and Romans, and then there's this long Christian thing where everybody was all like weak and pathetic and all that, and then there was a quick burst of the old pagan Greek stuff and whatever during the Renaissance, but basically it's just all like slave mentality and everybody had kind of lost it and blah blah blah. I just don't think that's true. I just think it's you found these things all the way through in different people at different times. And the point for us now is what are you going to do about it? You know, how are you going to use these things? Are you going to just?
What are you going to do about it? Too?
Yeah, exactly.
Not just what are you going to
Here's
think
another
about
quote
it?
I found.
What are you going to talk about it?
Here's a quote.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. Yes, exactly. So I mean, obviously we're talking about it here, but we're talking about it because we're trying to do it in some ways, and then we're trying to encourage other people to do it in whatever ways. You know, it's like it's an open-ended thing. It's not like a strict, these are the exact practices we do, come and do these things. You know, it's not like hit over the head if you don't do exactly this way. This is kind of more experimental and open-ended at this stage anyway. Obviously the ancient schools had a certain way of doing it. You had certain practices even with regards to the written work where you had to investigate it and work in a certain way. So it was quite strict. And if you just didn't like that way of doing it, you would just go to a different school and learn from them. You know, you go to Epicurus instead of the Stoics or whatever. And so here's a quote from Nietzsche himself, and I can't remember, is this a letter or is it just in his notebooks? But it's in some. These were like an unpublished fragments, and he says, "So far as praxis is concerned, I view the various moral schools as experimental laboratories in which a considerable number of recipes for the art of living have been thoroughly practiced and lived to. The results of all their experiments belong to us as our legitimate property. Thus, we will not hesitate to adopt a Stoic recipe just because we have profited in the past from Epicurean recipes." So that's his mind. That's what he thinks. So these are
what is that? I've never read that. I don't think I've ever read that.
It's in a book. I think the name of it is Posthumous Fragments. I can't remember, is that a letter to somebody or is it just him writing to himself? I think maybe it's writing to himself. And there's loads of this stuff, and obviously the German professor, the Austrian professor we're talking about, he says, I think he was actually, he was a professor at a university in France, but anyway, he's Austrian. He's can obviously read all these things in the notebooks. I think there's still German notebooks of Nietzsche's that haven't been translated into English yet.
Yeah.
So there's loads of this stuff, and obviously it just makes sense because it's just natural behavior. I mean, that's what we do. We are doing practices, and you're trying to find other people who are doing it. Find the others. You know, Tim Leary's thing. It's like everyone does this. Why would he not do this? Especially because he was so lonely. You know, or like, I mean, it's in the books. He's trying to find people. Like it's all over the books when you read it like this. It's just not in the books where he's saying, "I want to start a school." Well, it kind of is in Zarathustra to people who read it, but it's not like blatant. And but there's a letter he writes early on to his friends when he's, really early on, when he's back in the philology days or whatever, and he's writing to someone about they should start our own academy. I can't remember the exact words he says. Very interesting. Not the Nietzsche that we normally hear about, huh?
No, not the one where it's sold online, typically. Again, it's a question of emphasis.
Those experimental laboratories.
Yeah.
That's like, you just go there and it's like a way of living. There's different ways of living and you experiment with them and then you work on yourself that way because it's just other group of people who figure out things that happen. Your teacher is somebody who's just further down the line than you. A lot of these ones will be started by one, like a mega skilled guru type guy, but often maybe not. Maybe it's just like just guys trying their best, They'd figure one thing out and then, or you get a few together and they different practices, they mash them together, it works for that certain time, then it just flourishes like flowers in a garden, and then the flowers just die and fall apart and become manure for something else. So, like, in that sense, Nietzsche's using all the Stoic recipes and the Epicurean recipes, and also Plato and everybody else. And those are that's like the manure we get from, an old culture in the past, that we can use the ideas again now in a new way. And it isn't a new way. It's not the same. So, like, I'm not a fan of trying to recreate those things. Like internet Stoics are kind of annoying.
Statue head accounts. Yeah.
But they're just kind of annoying the way they use it and do it.
Annoying.
And
they're annoying people. You can tell they're not really like that in real life too. It's all
either
just
the statue
fucking
heads, or they're like a mega successful rich person talking about it, like they're so hard they have to pretend to be poor some one day a week. Like
Ferris just
like,
eating beans once a
Taleb
month.
and all those, there's like those type guys just annoying Stoics. Like, oh, okay, sure, you can have a cold bath and because you don't have money for hot water, whatever. But the Epicurus is more interesting to me actually at the moment, because but his is more a withdrawing one, because he was like, the thing's fucked, everything's disintegrating around us, just withdraw and focus on wisdom, because you can't do anything about changing the culture at this point. He's quite. It's like after, I think Epicurus is born roughly the same time when Aristotle dies. So he's like a little, it's changed a bit by then, but it's not that far away, And but they're just like, well, you can't do much about it. Plato was obviously actively trying to rule the world, philosopher king style. And,
he was, It was very political, wasn't he? I don't know much about him, but I do know it's explicitly political.
He went off to Sicily, to the tyrant there,
Right.
And like
Syracuse, was it?
Yeah, and everything went wrong, obviously, at the whatever. But that was like, he was explicitly like Aristotle, obviously. So Nietzsche obviously had similar ideas, but then I think the feeling I get, and this is what our Austrian professor friend says. If I can try and find it, I will find this quote. He says, probably lost it now. Here it is. I shall argue that Nietzsche's projected schools in quotes, because he's been talking about the Platonic Academy and Epicurus' garden. I shall argue that Nietzsche's projected school is an attempt to merge the political intentions of the Academy with the practical insight, the scientific bent, and the ascetic practices of the garden philosophy, Epicurus. It is, or would, and then he's going back, it will be an Epicurean academy which counsels withdrawal from the actual political life of the day, but only for a limited time, and only until healing political action would again become possible at the end of the nightmare of nihilism. So they're like, it's just, so basically it's just not the time for something. It's like no
chance, forget about it.
Just for direct action, sometimes it's not, and sometimes you have to withdraw and wait, and sometimes it won't happen in your life. You just train other people and they'll do it later. That's I
feel like that's our time a bit still.
It is, yeah. I mean, good Spenglerian. I mean, I just think
you are a good Spenglerian.
There's nothing to be done.
At least one. Yeah.
Usually, the guy in the cave in his pants is the other thing we always mention, and the Spengler. But Spengler's is a similar idea. He is saying there's action to be done, though. He's not saying withdraw at all. He's actually saying the opposite. He's saying because it's the end of a civilization, there's a load of practical things needing done, and people need to be practical and not be thinking they'll have all these revolutions in culture and replenish the culture, because you can't, because it's the end of one. There's loads of practical things needing done. He's actually very practical, Spengler, but people don't read his other books, so they don't know. There's parts of it in Decline in the West. He says you're better off learning techniques and all these things.
Cool, because that's the current zeitgeist, I would say. Like, you could say that guys in our general sphere tend to be almost entirely focused on culture wars, trying to introduce new ideas and all this kind of stuff.
All of this, everything that's happening fits entirely in Spengler's model, all of it. I mean, people don't want to hear it. Nobody wants to hear it. Nobody can go full Spengler. Nobody. They just can't take it for different reasons. The people who are into the Greeks and the Romans and classicists don't like him because he's saying that's a different culture. It's not our culture. It's manure that's helped us grow ours and on those things. But it's not our culture. It's like the Greeks are a different culture that died. So classicists don't like him. Christians don't like him because he's saying Christianity is like one specific religion, the Magian civilization, the Near East civilization. It's not ours either. It's just kind of a pseudomorphosis ended up in the West. So obviously Christians don't like that. There's another more subtle way of interpreting that for Christians. I won't go into here, but you could have a pro-Spengler Christian view, actually, because Christianity's turned up in like 3 different cultures, so it's different from other religions, even in Spengler's model. But anyway, so Spengler's idea is that the Christians don't like him, the classicists don't like him, because obviously if you've dedicated your life to classical stuff, and he's saying that that's not really our thing, you're not going to do anything with it. Obviously, they're not going to like it. People who are just like needlessly optimistic are not going to like it. Needlessly optimistic. Yeah, I'm giving myself away by saying it like that. People who are like techno utopians and all those guys.
Yeah. Tech bros.
They're
Tech bros, the accelerationists.
Yeah, I mean, they think you can solve everything with technology. This is entirely
Ludicrous.
in Spencer's model at the end.
Absolutely ludicrous
It
claim,
becomes
by the way.
technical.
Yeah, ludicrous claim. Completely ludicrous.
Well, it's entirely in
claim.
Spengler's model. It's like a tail end of the Faustian thing, where it's like the worst part of the Faustian. It's just like the glimmers of it are left over, and it's all just pushed into big technical projects, which happened at the end, the last phase of other civilizations. They did big technical stuff. They didn't do the cool early big projects like cathedrals or the big pyramids and those things that different cultures did. They just do these sort of technical big, huge, the Colosseum and things like that. It's like big things, but they're not really cultural. They're like, it's like, it's just the end of civilization stuff. So we've got all that. That's what like accelerationism and stuff is like. That is our version of that, as far as I can see.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
so those guys don't like him either, because they're saying no, we can fix it this time. This time's different. Maybe it is different, because technology is definitely more extensive now. Maybe it's different, but it all fits.
Well, for me, I'll just interject just quickly. The weakness I see in it is the same weakness that all of these moralistic ways of looking at the world have. And for me, it's a denial of the human being and its true nature. And this idea that you need the technology and therefore the human being is going to be okay. It's not. The only way that could possibly happen is by the same means as something like Christianity tried to do it, by trying to oppress part of the human spirit, the human soul, the human gestalt, like what the human being really is. Like you can't fix that with technology. You can't fix the lower parts of the human being with, an AI chatbot. Like it's still missing the essential point, which is the same point Nietzsche is making about human biology, the organic and physiology. It cannot be subverted. It can't be held down. It can't be repressed. It's just going to keep coming up. And so my view has always been, well, okay, you may have all this lovely technology and all this stuff, but it's still going to be the human beast that's using it. So if everyone thinks it's going to lead to some sort of utopia, I just find that to be just utterly ridiculous. Like
it's just the internet all over again. Think of like
exactly.
Internet
Everyone's
came out,
just jacking off. Like that's basically what happened.
Everybody like
So-
we're going to be so this. All it did was
Yeah.
amplify behaviors and then became a surveillance system for controlling people or whatever. But in the beginning, it wasn't seen as that. It was seen as this totally freeing thing. Well, at the moment, AI seem like that. As in, once we get this, it'll free us by giving us all this power to do all these things that then we don't need to do. That isn't what will happen. It'll just end up a control thing.
Exactly. Just a nasty,
it'll bring out the worst of people.
Yeah.
It will accelerate the neurotic patterns people go on, because it's just going to become like feedback loops.
Yeah.
Encouraging you to go down these ridiculous paths and stuff. Some people will use it in good ways. A lot of people like the current internet. Some people in bad ways. It's just, this is like so obvious what always happens. It's amazing that people fall for it each new time.
It's incredible. But they do. You see them. You see them talk.
Biology
online,
thing.
Yeah.
It's going to solve everything, and then it will make monsters and fuck people up, and loads of people like it's just inevitable, all this stuff. But
yeah,
you can say that all this is inevitable, but it doesn't need to be like a blackpilling doom thing where like, oh, it's so terrible. You can just say this is the way it's going to be. Fuck it, let's do it anyway. Like that's legit to say it, but people don't do that. They have to pick a side and be it's all good or all bad.
True. Or the other way humans can do it, and I think this is what Nietzsche is saying, right? And Hyatt as well. the only hope the animal has is to acknowledge what it is, which no one does. Like, everyone has just got this completely deluded idea of what a human being is and what they are. They don't even really know what they are, to be honest. And without that honesty, without the essential honesty about, okay, this is what we are, this is our true nature, these are the things that drive us, and I just don't see how, these things won't be used in fucking horrifying ways. I mean, it's because it's inevitable that humans who don't know themselves and are driven by all sorts of abstractions and can't understand what the streamings in their body are doing and what drives them. It's inevitable that all of these things will be used to promote the lowest elements of the human nature. I think it's just what always happens pretty much every time. So I tend to agree with you. I think these things will probably just get misused, or not used to their fullest capacity, and everyone will end up just masturbating in more exotic ways, probably. I mean, that's probably what's going to happen.
Because you're talking about all the different drives, and like Nietzsche and others are saying, people are a multiplicity of different drives, and they're often conflicting with each other and contradict each other and at war with each other and all that stuff. Well, if that's the typical person who's not doing any kind of these practices to work on themselves, then obviously any technology is going to amplify those things. But for the few people who are going to do the practices in a serious way and try and transform themselves, the game that you're playing is to integrate and align and redirect all those forces in a positive way for yourself, and then, for other people indirectly through yourself. And like Nietzsche's, one of his main ideas is that all the good things, the good behaviors and feelings and all the higher stuff, a lot of the higher stuff grows out of deeper, darker, nasty stuff. So like out of envy and hatred and anger and all that. And the point is, the good things can develop out of that, but you need to like cultivate yourself. So the more people use technology stuff without doing practices alongside it, the worse they'll get. But I'd imagine if people are doing the practices, they can use the technology in more intelligent ways and kind of sidestep the madness to an extent until it just all gets too much and breaks apart. The other thing the techno-utopian types don't seem to forget, and it's similar to what you said about they just forget the body and biology, basically, that they're an animal, is that they forget that cyberspace and what's meta call it? This like virtual reality world and all that they think they're going to make. All of these things, they're based on physical. Yeah. They're all based on physical equipment in a big warehouse that needs to be kept cool at a certain temperature and all that. That won't last forever. Like the cultural structures around that make it possible for that to exist won't last forever. So how can the thing that is like, how can the compute from that last forever? It's ludicrous what they're saying. Like, even the sun will burn out at some point. And they're like, yeah, but we'll just travel and go to a different sun, get a different sun, or we'll reignite the sun and spark up or whatever. It's just like, no, you're like, everything will crumble before you get anywhere near that stuff. The sign of like someone who's totally deluded or whether they're realistic is whether they talk about immortality or longevity. If they mean literally immortality, they're deluded. If they mean longevity, we can use technologies to live a lot longer. Yeah, sure, great. I'm up for it. Literal immortality is like a religious belief. It's not. It can't happen. At some point, something will happen. Just numbers game. Even if you're like indestructible, you think eventually some new event will happen that destructs you. Might be 100 billion years, but you're dead. Do you understand what I mean? It's not like but
totally. Yeah, it's physically impossible. It's like
you have to listen to what they're saying, which one they're talking about, because sometimes people say immortality, but they're talking about longevity. Hyatt, I think, is a person like that. But often they're talking about like immortality, and they really mean like, I will live forever and ever, and I won't die. So now it's like you know what it is. It's no longer a technological game plan. It's a religious belief.
It's like Moonbra. Moonbra. What's his name?
Yeah, I mean, his is all told up for this crazy self-experimenters, obviously, but that guy is he's going to die.
Did you know he is a Mormon? So he comes
But
here.
when, but he will.
Right. Yeah, of course he will. Actually, I think I saw a tweet from him saying that he will die in the most appropriate and amusing way possible for him. So
He's really good at Twitter. He's really funny. He's really good.
Is.
He's like one of the best posters. Like, and people were, right when he first started getting popular, he was getting mocked heavily, and everything people mocked him about, he was appearing underneath and saying something funnier than the first thing, than what they'd said, So I like him. I don't dislike him. I wouldn't do that style of it, but I like him. I find him likable, and we need more of those crazy people doing stuff like that, because they'll come up with stuff that other people can use. These are kind of ascetic. It's that guy who's doing ascetic practices.
Yeah,
he is a self-experimenter in the Nietzschean vein. Like, he actually is like, it's like just one weird version, a weird technical version of it. So again, Spengler, this would make sense. This would be the second religiousness that comes at this time, at this stage. All these weird little religions that are getting mixed in with other cultures and stuff. It's all happening.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the other day, you know who else is Brian Johnson? Is the cannibal, no, not the carnivore guy, the testicle eating dude. What's he, forget what he calls himself. The guy that goes and eats raw meat everywhere.
Liver King?
Yeah, the Liver King. He's Brian Johnson too.
Is he? It's not the singing of AC/DC. Is he not Brian Johnson too?
Yeah, what is he? Is that Brian Johnson? No, it is. Yeah, I think Brian Johnson's AC/DC. Yeah.
A trio.
Yeah, must be the accelerationist Uriah. We're in a simulation, obviously. I mean, with that kind of stuff going on. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, well, the other thing about Boon Bra is that he's a Mormon. He comes from Mormon stock. So it's kind of little wonder that he has a kind of somewhat religious outlook to
because they have a certain slant on this sort of.
They do, don't they? Get their own planet, I thought.
Christian planet. Yeah, it's got a technical kind of angle to it in the same way as like Scientology does, doesn't it? It's obviously it's got that spin on the end of the ancient stuff. It's a modern Western version of the Christian thing, really. And that would make sense. He just says, "Well, I can't believe the stuff that's in the manual, but I'm going to, and I don't think the practices you're using work quite as well, but I'm going to keep the same game plan, the same aims, and just do them in a slightly different way and pretend that I'm not religious anymore." It seems to be what he's the.
Yeah, indeed.
I'm going to go to hell, live forever, and go to heaven, but I just don't trust your theory. I'm going to do it a different way.
And fair enough. It is hard to believe. Yeah, that one. It's
so
probably.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you look at a lot of this stuff, in a lot of those kind of things, and think, this is just our current modern end of civilization. No end. I don't mean it's going to collapse, but like last phase of our Western civilization, probably hundreds of years to go, probably. But last phase. This is the kind of things that our version would be in a high-tech culture. It would be like if at the end of the Roman stuff and all that, weird cults and all that were on the go then. It's just stuff like they're all being imported from outside. We're at that stage, they've imported all the Buddhism and all the other stuff. And the local stuff has just gone weird. It's like weird kind of structure. The structure's similar to the Christian stuff, but it's like technological. You're going to go uploaded into the cloud or whatever is instead of going to heaven. I mean, it's the same idea.
Yeah.
You get resurrection of the body, cryogenically frozen, and reanimated. It's the same thing. It's the same ideas. They're just like said in a different way, a more technological way. And that, again, it's a Spengler thing, but it just goes from religious religious feelings and terminologies in the beginning, and then at the end it gets dried out and it just becomes technical, and the patterns are still there, but the life is kind of drained out of them. Just like an old person looks vaguely similar to they looked when they were young, but kind of withered and dried out. It's that at a civilization level. So when I hear the guys go, no, we can invent our way out of this, we can build our way out of this and solve everything, I'm just like, yeah, you just sound like a 65-year-old man saying he's going to become a professional football player or something, It's just fun.
Yes, it is fantasy.
You can get old gracefully, you don't need to keep over and die. Like, you can be fit right to the end. You can be like, I saw somebody recently was like, you can be making films in like Clint Eastwood until you're 95. It's no problem.
Yeah. One upside to all of this for, doomed Western civilization, if you are right, of course, or Spengler's right, is that, you have a lot of influences in the West. So you've got, as you say, you've got Buddhism, you've had Buddhist travel here, you've had, Indian energetic practices and Tibetan practices, and you obviously have the traditional practices of ancient Greece, and you have quite a vast barrow of manure that's building up here. So, you say all this stuff, but I do wonder, it's quite a rich tapestry of stuff kind of forming here.
Yeah,
Whereas
but this is it's the next cultures, though. That's like where
sure,
it comes from.
it's kind of
Like
what I was
the end of
getting
the
at.
moment time.
Yeah, yeah. But I guess what I'm just bringing it back to Nietzsche in particular, and his, this whole crisis of nihilism that's going on, and I think what did he say? It was going to be 200 years from when he wrote his book, or 250, I forget how long. But we were going to go through this phase of chaos, everything else. And actually, just recently I was in Tibet and China and a few other places. And what really struck me was a lot of guys will talk about tradition and, what a wonderful thing it is. And, the problem with the West is there's no tradition. I actually really got the strong impression visiting these places that it was quite the opposite. And not so much in Tibet, but certainly in China and places like that, I got the feeling, and even Nepal, I got the feeling that these places are in this permanent state of stasis. Like it just never moves. I would imagine it's probably been like that for, I can't even imagine how long, several millennia. There's no real feeling of vitality or newness or anything like that. And when I look around, it's nice and everything. Don't get me wrong; it's interesting and it's okay. But there's no ferment. There's no cultural ferment at all. There's no other influences other than Western technology and stuff like that. The culture just seems very stable. Like it doesn't move anywhere. It doesn't do anything. And the same dogmas that we're talking about seem to just have not only a stranglehold on the people, but they've been shaping the people generation after. You're kind of getting this culture that just never moves. Whereas people may detest the lack of tradition or the chaos in the West. But, I think, we've got a good big bucket of manure that is forming at the moment. And long term, I am kind of, as long as the species in general doesn't fuck it up, which is a very distinct possibility, I am somewhat hopeful about whatever comes after Western civilization. It could be potentially quite interesting. But
yeah, I love all the mix of stuff, and that's obviously how new things come together. Even like, if you look at anything who has original sounding ideas and have like good insights and stuff, even like anybody alive now writing or whatever, usually you can trace, if you learn about what their influences are, you can usually trace it. There's like two big things that they know about and they've just kind of mushed them together. So they come up with these new insights by, they processed one way of thinking and techniques or understanding through another. And then they come up with something new by combining them. And obviously we're doing that with the cultures do that. Obviously, like a growing culture will be on the edge of the cultures doing that. Each culture will express itself in its own way. And then on the edges, it's kind of interacting with other ones and they kind of absorb other ones, repurpose them. It's kind of how humans do it. You take in food, you repurpose the food, and then you put out the stuff you don't want. You take in more, you're absorbing and taking nutrients from things, but you're always transforming it for your own use. Cultures do this with other cultures. And I think that's part of what's happening now, where it's the Western way of doing things is kind of absorbing all these things. Look at the Western, the way Buddhism has been interpreted in some ways, and the way Northwest European Christianity is different from the Near East. And when it comes to like practice and stuff, great come from people mixing two things. Like they'll have a Western interpretation of some old practice that's useful for people now. So like with the technology stuff, it's whether there's all this technology now. It's whether the next if Western civilization comes to an end gradually, if it just withers away and new ones replace it, it's whether they can keep the technology and maintain it or not. Because they might start with this technology and AI. I mean, that could be horrendous depending on which people take over, which way they do it. They could just be like total control. If it was like the Chinese way of doing it, it would be horrible. If on top of everybody,
despicable,
like the social credit system. And I'll imagine that, like in another 100 years, how much more controlled that'll be and manipulating people's behavior and stuff. But using stuff designed by Westerners who were into freedom and individuality and those things. In the meantime, we live here now, and let's just take what works, mix it together, teach other people, and make things better as they are. Because, as I said, even in gloomy Spengler's model, there's tons of stuff to be done and loads of things to be done, and people should be practical now and learn things and do things, not just keel over and die.
Yeah.
I mean, in his model, we're not at the collapse of Rome. We're at the collapse of the Republic becoming the empire. It's like hundreds of years before it collapses. So
good times ahead. Sounds great. Yeah.
But like in those days, they were like all the stuff was coming from the East. Like the Mithraic mysteries and stuff like that. So like loads of the soldiers were like in the Mithraic cults, and all these things were coming from the East and stuff. And there's all these sun cults and all these like stuff that wasn't the traditional Roman stuff, which is obviously the Greek stuff.
Of course, you had Hellenistic Buddhism, which was a very interesting syncretization.
There's lots of really cool things loads of interesting mixes and stuff like that. That's fascinating, and you learn things just by seeing how things mix. I mean, like Japan, it was really interesting seeing how all the different things there have mixed together and into like a unique thing. And there's all these things, but they're unique things that flourish in one place, and you can't keep forever. And again, this is a Nietzsche thing, a Heraclitus thing. It's just always changing, constant process. War is the father of all things.
Just on that, can we talk about war quickly? Because I see this all the time, obviously online, and obviously being young guys full of testosterone, they hate liberals. I get it. They want to go to war and, learn all those martial skills, which that's fine. I've got nothing against that. That's good. But I feel like there's somewhat discounting quite a lot of Nietzschean thought if you just look at it in terms of actual martial action. And in my reading, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, the concept of war, and we're talking about drives and inner mastery and all this kind of stuff, and it is a very interesting one, because I think people get confused with Nietzsche a little bit, because he does seemingly contradict himself. And he does make statements, for example, that don't seem to fit together particularly well. And I think that part of the difficulty comes in taking him like very literally. So I think you're meant to take him literally, don't get me wrong, but I also think that you're also in a way not taking him completely literally. And what I mean by that, particularly in terms of war, is I feel like Nietzsche is excellent at identifying, I would say, greater patterns in the world. And war, obviously, you're talking about Heraclitus before as well, and how he said war is the father of all. It's interesting to then extrapolate that concept away from the literal interpretation of going to war and killing and being shot at and stuff, and into a war on the self, a war on the human physiology and a war on the human biology. And this is one of my favorite ideas as well. It's from this idea of conflict giving rise to something higher, to something much better. Again, in Western culture at the moment, it's not very popular to think that way about yourself. It's more about accepting yourself and, you're just wonderful as you are and all this kind of stuff. So it's very against the current mold to say that, well, actually, in a way, you should create conflict in yourself. Creating a conflict and coming to a higher state as a result of it is a much better thing to be doing. And I was thinking about that because I think it's another shortcoming that a lot of young guys online, they instantly go for the spear chucking element, and again they're missing out on this whole greater idea of mastering themselves through this kind of engagement with a war on the self. Do you have any thoughts on that as a general idea, as Nietzsche pointing out, like a general principle,
Yeah, I totally
a
agree.
general pattern
I think
in the universe?
Yeah, I think that is how things, I think, conflict, opposing forces rub up against each other, fight each other, and then new things emerge from that. A third thing will emerge, and then it becomes one of an opposing force, and on and on. And the trick is to, inside yourself, to recognize the wars that are happening inside you, because they're happening anyway. Often you're just coming to decisions, not always in your best interest, and one drive is winning over another one. So it can be useful for a while to kind of investigate what your real drives are, and to do practices where you're seeing your real emotions and following them down. What emotion is behind that emotion? So the surface emotion usually isn't the one; it's usually something else. But if you get too dragged into that thing, you just become passive and obsessed with those stuff. So but as a tool for a while, that can be useful, and then you have to learn to put them against each other and use that to energize you. It's like in the posture work. One of the central techniques I use is you do opposing movements. So you'll move in one body part in an opposite direction to another body part. And you're doing that with the various pairs of bony parts. You're doing movements in certain ways that, like, precisely defined parts are moving away from one another. And in between, things are being stretched and moved around. And that's what brings you up, not trying to stand up and pull yourself straight. But by doing horizontal movements can actually make you go vertical. Very strange. But it's similar to, it's like an organ on yourself. You don't want to move two parts away from one another. It feels weird in the beginning. You do it enough times, you're just doing it, and now it's below surface. You don't even realize you're doing it. Then you find out you were actually doing that anyway. You had all these little wars going on around in your movement, in your posture, that you were below the surface of awareness. You just got used to them. And it's only when you prod them around and intervene, you start noticing things.
And
that's why it's quite bad to start this stuff. It's better to start and not finish,
Yeah, totally. And presumably, this is why you'll get, so I guess I'm outlining a general principle I see in the world, like this anti-war attitude, which, interestingly, now I think about it, isn't just in the political sphere, but it definitely extends to the personal sphere. So everything these days is about self-acceptance, you're wonderful as you are, all the poetry that, newly single women on Instagram post all the time about how wonderful they are, and everyone else, needs to fit into just how brilliant and wonderful they are. But this kind of thinking is it's quite just through everything, actually, these days. It's
nice as well, because I try not to use the word alignment now. I said it earlier, right. Actually, I try even the word alignment, the way it means, technically not really, but the feelings that go along with that now are stillness, everything being in agreement with one another, peaceful. Do you know what I mean? I feel aligned. Everything's aligned. It's all like the opposite of war and opposing forces. And so if you're I don't talk about alignment for posture, because sometimes you're aligning certain parts with other parts if you were to look at a picture from someone's side on, but alignment has this connotations now that is take you away from the things you need to do in order to create a sort of higher peacefulness. But actually, the higher peacefulness is dynamic. You can be poised. Here's a better way of saying it. You can be poised. So you can be, say you're looking at someone sitting side on and they don't look like they're moving. They look perfectly still from the side. But really what's happening is they're not holding themselves still, and also they're not just at peace, flopped over. There's multiple movements that are happening in real time right now that are going away from one another. This has been trained in, so you're not having to really make an effort to do this, but there's opposing movements that, because they cancel each other out, imagine you're pulling an elastic band with your two hands, pull your hands apart, elastic band in the middle. Your hands are not moving, but there's this force in the elastic band. If you're to let go one hand, the elastic band would ping. So you've got this trapped energy. So it's in dynamic tension. Well, you can have dynamic poise like that, where you're poised and not moving from the outside, But actually on the inside, you're actually doing movements to keep yourself poised. Does that make sense? So you're like at war.
Yeah.
Your movements are at war, you could say poetically, but your result is a sort of higher peacefulness. You're not just flopped over at peace. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, higher,
So
how would you say, an integration of forces. Yeah.
Yes. So that's just a posture version. So Nietzsche, I think, and others this is the kind of thing they're talking about in all the drives, like your all your emotions and your will, your goals, your enemies. This is like having enemies. Well, what's what's useful about having enemies? If it's in a non-resentful, pathetic way, if you have enemies, it's because it creates a tension between you and them and what they're doing, and then you pull yourself up with it. It improves you by rubbing yourself up against that. You know, yes. Plato has a good thing in one of the dialogues. I think it's the Republic actually, where Socrates says, they ask about they're saying what's the best way of governing a city or something like this, and he says, well, in order to understand that, let's use a metaphor, and we'll use a metaphor of in order to understand the best way of a person governing their soul, let's use the metaphor or analogy of the best way to govern a city, and then we'll rub them. It creates a spark and creates a light, sheds some light on what we're looking at. So he's like this idea. Even he's in that. Even Socrates is saying you take two things and rub them up against each other. That produces an insight. Do you know what I mean? So it's not like with ideas. You can do it with movements, like I've said with posture. Nietzsche seems to be talking about you're doing it. A lot of it's doing it with emotions and will and those kind of deeper drives. And it's not at all about peacefulness. You know, it's like, he even says that somewhere, doesn't he? It's like war, not peace.
Yeah.
The Antichrist, I guess.
Yeah.
And not war, not peacefulness at all. This is what he's talking about. And it's not like go out and start killing people and stuff like that. He's not saying that.
That's how it's taken, right? That's how a lot
Yes, that's how they all take it, yeah.
But he does mean that too, kind of.
He's also not saying, he's not saying be a pacifist. That's an extension of this other stuff. If you work in yourself and you do these things, then maybe situations arise where your people in your place have to go to war to defend yourself and whatever in another place. You know, he's not ruling that out, but it's not just that. And it's like, if you've ever, so like anyone listening to this probably done Eastern meditation type practices and stuff. Well, obviously, if you think about it, you're at war with yourself all the time there. You're like, you want to stay focused and you're just on the next thing. You want to move, you're not meant to move. You're constantly at war with yourself. Like somebody's in a Zen monastery. It's just a bunch of guys sitting, not moving. A load of them are currently at war with themselves. Some of them aren't. Some of them are in states or whatever, but some of them are, especially beginners, are at war with themselves. But it looks peaceful. You know, it's like there's this kind of dynamic going on all the time. And that's what you use to change yourself. So like in order to, like as I say, with posture or to change your gait or any of these things, you have to think about it as dynamic and moving, and you're trying to get all the drives and things somehow aligning and working together. See, I'm using alignment again. Somehow working together and against each other in such a way for the higher good of all the things. Not trying to get them all to go in the same direction. Yeah, like if you try to get all your movements to go in the same direction, you wouldn't be able to walk. You like things have to go against one another, but you have a sort of bigger goal that everything is drawn towards. You know, so like, and this is Nietzsche's thing about having the will and stuff like that, and having these higher tasks and things. You need something that you could call alignment through time and action. But when people say alignment now, they don't mean through time and action. They mean stillness and out of action and passive. They don't. Do you know what I mean? It's like That's why I try to avoid the word.
Yeah, I guess it's the same universal thing, right? It's this. What do you call it? He called it the ascetic ideal. So it's this kind of idea that devaluing, the organic, as you say, all these forces that you're pointing out, these forces in opposition, like in you and in the world. And it just shows up everywhere all the time in different forms. And I think that's
Take a monk in a monastery. He's like, what could be more peaceful than the monk? He's walking around the garden, his hands together and all that, so peaceful. And then he's in a cell and he's whipping himself with a rope and all. Absolutely at war with his inside, and he's disciplining himself and becoming more self-overcoming is what they're doing.
Yeah.
Whether Nietzsche thinks they are or not, whether they think they're being...
His thought is subtle because one of the things I've written about a couple of times in this respect, right, is how many similarities there are. But it's just, for example, we've been talking about, Nietzsche and people like Hyatt, like viewing human drives as impersonal, right? Like you don't control them. They're just something that's there. And I think Nietzsche himself even denied there was a self, like in the sense that we think about it. And then you look at Buddhism, and obviously Buddhism has a huge amount of literature on the fact that the self is this kind of illusory construct that, on the one hand, you got Nietzsche saying we are the product of impersonal drives and we don't have a self. And then, and then on the other hand, you had the Buddhists basically saying exactly the same thing, is that you are, a result of things that you had nothing to do with, and that you basically are coming from yourself is therefore also illusory. So there seems like there's one thing that's always, I think, confuses people, and it confused me too for a long time, is that there are these similarities, well, not similarities, they're talking about exactly the same thing, actually, in practice. It's exactly the same thing. But it's ultimately then how you use that realization. I think that's a determining factor, right? But you're absolutely right to say that a Buddhist monk, and at least in the formative stages, is in a constant amount of pain and suffering. I can attest to that because it hurts. Like, it's not nice at all, and every part of your body doesn't want to do what it's doing. So you're literally engaged in warfare against your monkey mind and monkey body. And I really see that, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I see that as no different from what Nietzsche's saying, the Nietzschean project, as we've been talking about it. It's really exactly the same thing.
It goes back to Plato, this, by the way. This idea where you're halfway, men are halfway between ape and angel, or whatever
Angel,
words
that's what
they
he
use.
said. Right? Did he say that? That's his quote.
Ape
and
I don't
angel.
know if it's angel, but it's that kind of idea. It's like
Right, yeah.
higher spiritual being and ape, and men are halfway between. And the whole idea of all these practices is take yourself more towards the higher one than the lower one. The disagreement would be that a lot of the religious ones are denying the lower and pretending it doesn't exist and trying to go just straight to the higher version.
Straight to the
But
higher.
Nietzsche's idea would be you have to start from the lower version, accept it, and then you start from there.
Yeah,
which is
get rid of the objective morality, the dictates of morality, right? That are imposed on
you're like
the body.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of morality. A type of morality is built into the animal. Actually, you don't need the outside stuff. Like we're designed as social, tribal. Is like primates have a morality of their own. It's not like intellectual ethics or anything, but they have their sort of morality and rules and stuff. Like social animals have kind of rule sets and stuff that we have. We already have those things, and there's like a perfectly natural theory. You could easily have a natural theory of morality in a way. A lot of people don't like it, but I don't see why not. And but you don't need to just say it's just that. So that's like, again, it's always justice.
It's the just thing.
But you can have the two opposing ideas.
Yeah.
It's like, but you can have the two opposite, like transcendence, all the spiritual things and mystical insights and mystical experiences and all those things that we want and aim for and things like that. And then you can at the same time have the real hardcore biology down to the biomechanics and all these things that like are really hard, harsh, concrete constraints on what it is to be a human, and anatomy, brain design, or bad brain wiring and all these things. You can have both of them together and hold the two what seem like opposites at the same time, and then you have a dynamic tension in between that compels you to action, drives you to do these practices. That's what it makes you move, So like it's like, who's it said? I think it's Fitzgerald, the novelist, the guy who wrote The Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
He said something like, the sign of a high rate intelligence is being able to hold two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time and still be able to function.
Right.
Something like that.
Yeah.
This is it. That's what it is. It's you see this all the time. Christopher Hyatt's practice of side-by-side reading, where you take two books or more that are completely on opposite subjects, and every day you read a little bit of each and try and work them in together. compare and contrast them and try and work them in together, and they seemingly seem opposites, and you create new ways of thinking and new ideas and start wiring your brain together in weird ways because the books are so opposite. They're either like completely opposite in ideas or they're like opposite in presentation, so like one could be like about maths and another one about emotions. One could be about religion and one about science, like whatever, and work them together. Or poetry and like hard analytical, semantic, linguistic stuff, and then poetry, like that, and try and mix them together,
I did a commercial legal manual and the Iliad a couple of months back.
Wow. Okay.
It's really difficult, actually. So I was doing it after a session, and like it's super hard. It's not easy. It's because I tried. Yeah, sorry, you go.
Your brain's just not designed to put them together. Like you're not, because think about it, you're reading books on certain topics, you're understanding it all makes sense. Then you read something else, and you don't really remember what was it, and then they live in different worlds, the different subjects and the different things, and presumably there's whole areas of your brain, pathways in your brain, and that are just disconnected on these things, and so then it's no wonder that when it comes to movement, the idea of using sort of reasoning and even like quote mathematical precision about different movements and parts relative to each other in space, geometrical relationships, that just sounds so opposite of like feelings and moving and embodiment that people just recoil at this. But actually you can just wire them in together through practice. You're just thinking as you're moving. It's obvious once you start doing it, but in the beginning, because our brains and our culture separate these things, we separate movement from thinking. You're kind of disintegrating yourself by doing this. We're disintegrating everybody, children, everybody by doing this. When presumably humans didn't separate them in the beginning. You thinking how to plan a hunt and then went hunting. You weren't reading about the philosophy of hunting or the the mechanics of the hunters, weapons and whatever. You were doing it as well as thinking about it. It's all one thing.
Yeah.
Different phases of the same thing.
Very true.
And I think that's what Nietzsche's doing, is trying to get people to bring all these things together again.
Yes. Yeah. Getting rid of the taboo against human biology, the hatred of life. I think he's trying to offer another way than what's been offered traditionally. That's for sure. And I think the more you look into it, one criticism, and I think I've leveled this at him in the past, is, he broke all this stuff down, but really didn't offer much. I think he kind of did. The deeper I get into it and the deeper I read things, I kind of, and obviously you're telling us about these letters, which I wasn't aware of. I mean,
and a lot of it's between the lines, even in the books, though. It's
it is. Yeah, definitely.
Another thing Horst Hatter says about Nietzsche, it's in one of his videos online. It's only a few videos, and they're like bad quality, but production, but they're great information, ideas in them. One of them, he's talking about how Nietzsche to be read. He says there's a note where Nietzsche explains this somewhere. I can't remember the note. I don't have it, but he says something about, in order to understand him, you have to translate the written word back into oral, spoken word, in order to reach the insight, because his writing process was the opposite. So he goes out walking in nature for hours every day. Again, that's an ascetic practice, walking in the mountains for hours every morning. And he would have the papers in his pocket, and whenever he had an insight, an idea, he would just take out the paper and scribble it down. And then later that night, he would go and he would translate something. He'd start transferring it into the notebooks and writing it with it. And apparently, I think he said like a third of the stuff he wrote on his walks is published, but 2/3 aren't. So that's quite a lot. He's still published, reworked.
Yeah.
In terms of written pages, a third was published and 2/3 wasn't. So, but what he would do was, he must say this in a letter somewhere, but what he would, or one of his friends said or something, but what he would do is he would write on the paper, he'd write down his notes like anybody. You go for a walk and write down the notes that come to you. And then he would go home and he would read them out loud to find the best ways of saying the thing that was closest to the insight he had. Because you have an insight, you have like this idea comes to you, and then you try and translate it into words sequentially. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
There's like there's the insight. It's not the same thing, you know, and that's why you're grappling for the right words, because it's not quite the right words. Well, what's that mean? It means you have this whole insight, and you're trying to find words to describe to that insight. And obviously, there's never going to be perfect words. So you're trying to word it in such a way that other people can read the words and then go, "Oh," and have the same insight you had, which is whole again, you know? So you're going from whole to sequence. They're going from sequence reading to whole. And Nietzsche's thing was
Right.
he would go home, he would read out loud, say out loud. At least this is what Horst Tatter says, that he would say out loud the fragments that he'd written or whatever, and then pick the ones that were the best they were closest to the insight. But then what the person has to do when you read it, you start with the written word, and then you have to say it out loud. As Zarathustra, he says something about saying it out loud. I can't remember the phrase. And then then you can have the insight. So you're reading the words, saying the words, insight. And all these old philosophical schools were oral based. You know, the main teachings were spoken, not written.
Right.
Written stuff was like a tool to help people, like the dialogues or whatever. Those are just tools to help people have the insights. But all the philosophers come along later and think that the tools are the real thing. That it's the doctrine is the real thing.
Yeah, the objective moral system, right?
He says this, he says that. You know, they're completely away from life, completely away from the practice.
Yeah,
and it's backwards. So, but it's essential. You need the written part. You need the writings, but the writings isn't the main thing. It's a tool. It's an instrument for developing insights.
Sure. Yeah.
Passing insights for creating in you think of a dialogue. Plato's dialogues. It's a war. They're arguing with each other.
Conflict.
It's kind of like I mean, obviously it's contrived and that, but it's like there's like a pushback, and there's like it's not always a pushback. Sometimes they just agree with Socrates in such a stupid way. It's stupid, you know. But in general, you know, the whole idea is the back and forward, and then you come to a sort of higher thing. And sometimes he just drops ideas, and it doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't mean he believes in the things. It's more to get you thinking in a certain way, and then you have insights. It's not like a set of doctrines. And Nietzsche's attacks on Plato and stuff he's really attacking all the Plato scholars and the Plato.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's the way people have taken these thinkers that's often the problem, right?
Like
Not
Plato's
so much to think of themselves.
Plato's beliefs and all that.
Yeah.
Saying Plato's beliefs are this, and this because it's in a dialogue is like saying Shakespeare's belief is this because it's in a play. You don't know that if that's its actual belief or not, you know? Do you know, like...
Yeah.
Okay, he's Hamlet. Is he... Well, Hamlet says this one time, and then he says this other thing. He's Plato's... Shakespeare both, or he's like, you know, like, it's not clear what's the author and what's the character, especially with Hamlet, because Hamlet's like, Hamlet becomes his own fucking person, separate from Shakespeare almost. So even Shakespeare couldn't pin down Hamlet. So it's like hard to know what's a belief, and if you don't think about it like that at all, you just go, oh, hang on a second, they're just writing these things to help people think so they can have insights and rule their lives better. It makes way more sense.
Yeah, people focus too much on that element. In fact, almost entirely they focus on that way of looking at these things, right? But as I used to, I can remember when I was younger, I used to read books like that and think, oh, I wonder which bit's which and who's trying to get at what. But now I'm very much, I see writing and reading this stuff as very much a gestalt. And actually, it makes a whole lot more sense when you read things that way, like, you know, and it forces that interaction with the words and the thinking and the reflection on past experiences. Yeah, I don't worry myself with the minutiae at all anymore. To me, you know, very often the messages are pretty clear, but not in a, how would you say, not in a strict academic, you know, I don't know how to say it, like a, you know, a strict academic way. Like it's designed to sort of spur something in you more than you analyze it and try to figure out.
It's also why reading something you disagree with can be so beneficial, because you go to war with it. It's the reaction it has and the growth it has in you. It's not about adding more to things you agree and align with. Do you know what I mean? It's like... Absolutely. You have to argue with the book. You have to, like, even when you agree with
other. And with each other, I might add. There's altogether too much agreement.
That's the whole idea with the schools again.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
why they had the
good point.
schools. They're like, that's why they're arguing. And Nietzsche has that lovely thing where he says about Plato as the great erotic, the wrestler. It's just wrestling. Like the dialectic is just wrestling with words, basically.
Yeah.
And that's Plato's name means, is it like broad-shouldered or something like that? Means it means it's like his wrestling name. It's like a nickname he had as a wrestler. He just translated that to that mentality, that fighting mentality, just into words. But it's for like a higher cause. But you still have to do the fighting.
Hmm.
It's not destructive. It's constructive fighting, you could call it. So I think a lot of Nietzsche's stuff about war is like this.
Yeah, I think so. I totally agree. It's because, again, it's a universal pattern. It's not meaning literally go to war.
Yeah,
It can mean that, but it also
and
just
I'm more
means,
convinced now that the whole Overman type idea it just means it's just his way of saying enlightened human that's overcome their current sense of
again,
simple.
when I got like really concerned about the genealogy of the term, and like I was trying to figure out literally what it meant and looking for everything in his writing, I actually feel like it's fairly obvious in a way. Like it doesn't really.
It's totally obvious. If you've done Eastern practices and that, and you have like insight where you have a narrow sense of self, and then you or like you have this small mind, and then you become the big mind, or whatever. They have all these different ways of saying it. It's all just fits under the category of self overcoming. You have this small self, and you overcome that, and then there's another one. Then sometimes you can overcome that one too. It's debate about how long it goes on for, or whatever. And there's certain overcomings of the self that are like permanent, and they don't drop back down. Some of them just sort of fleeting experiences. Some of them are like the whole structure of yourself and your consciousness is structure of it has changed. The way you see is permanently changed, and it won't go back. And it's a good thing. It's just awakenings and enlightenment. It's just a Western way of saying it. I'm totally convinced of that now. And he'd had an enlightenment experience, and this is how, and it came to him. Everyone's heard the story about Zarathustra. His claim is that he was like hyped up basically and wrote each part in 10 days, which is quite a short time to write something like that. He wrote the whole thing in 10 days.
Incredible.
And in a sort of frenzy, I can't remember the words he used, but it's a kind of frenzy. It's clear he's had like an awakening experience, and he's having all like presumably all energetic Kundalini type experiences along with it.
Can we talk about that?
Which explains a lot of his health issues. Explains some of his health issues.
Yeah.
And his neuroticisms and all that. And it's just a Western guy who's like, with his background, who has various kind of neurotic things from his religious upbringing, and trained as a classicist and all that stuff, and lived where he lived and wherever, and he's having these experiences, and this is how he describes them. It's just that. But it's like, it's not any more complicated than that. It's like you have, if you've had any kind of awakening type experience from doing an Eastern practice, I don't think anyone would disagree that you are more, your new self, or your new understanding of self, put it that way, is, I think they would agree that you're now, it's an over version of your old version. It's above, it's a better, newer version. So, self-overcoming, the overman, it's all there. It's just not as weird as it first sounds.
Yes, and it's pro-life a bit more than those other things are. It's using it in a more embrace of life and how it can make life better.
It's a more dynamic, active version instead of like sitting still. He's not sitting still. His practices are walk and think and write and dance, and dancing's a big one as well. It's not sit still and watch your sensations. That's just a different type of practice.
Sitting in a cave in your underpants, which has to be invoked at least once.
Well, he does imply that Zarathustra was doing that in the beginning. He
that's a good point. Okay. I take that back.
So, there's other reasons why he has to start like that, obviously, because why he chooses Zarathustra and stuff. But it's totally transformed my view of him as a philosopher since I read this our Austrian friend, because I just can't see it in any other way now. It's just so obvious, and I can't believe it wasn't this obvious before.
I agree. I haven't read the whole book yet, but from what I've read so far,
stuff, it's in the notebooks and the fragments and stuff. And
sure,
there's another book that Horst Hatter edits called Nietzsche's Therapeutic Teaching for Individuals and Culture. So I was like, when I first read this Nietzsche's therapeutic teaching, I was just like, I don't really like this. I thought it was like going to be some really basic bitch psychology
Sounds sus.
version. It isn't at all. Like, it's the idea that you're the therapist for the culture because they need new ways of thinking, new ways of living, and you're healing yourself and the culture this way. And it's what Plato and everybody else was doing. Epicurus and Nietzsche. So that's the other book. So in that, it's like edited by loads of essays. I haven't read them all. Only read a few. Horst Hatter has a few. He writes the intro and the article at the start, which is good. And you can find PDFs of Nietzsche's unpublished stuff. Well, obviously it's published now, but stuff that was unpublished. There's like a whole series of them. I forget what it's called. There's loads of volumes of it, and you can get them, and it'll give you the notebooks of what he was writing round about the time of different books. So you can read the notebooks that around Zarathustra, you can read the notebooks around the Dawn and whatever other books, and the later stuff as well also. So it gives you nice thinking in the background. So obviously there's the thing, well, it's in the notebooks, it's not in the books, so how much does he still agree with it after? But you can tell his way of thinking, and he's trying to heal himself. He's got that wounded healer kind of thing going on, where he's, the guy's trying to heal himself.
Is it Chiron?
Chiron, yeah. So
what was he? He was some sort of creature, wasn't he? I forget what he was. Was it a?
I think it's like half horse, is it, or something?
Half horse, yeah. I think. What were they called again?
Centaur.
Centaur.
Or is that half?
He was a centaur.
Half. The centaur with a horse. I don't remember. But yeah, Nietzsche has that kind of thing going on where if he wasn't broken, trying to fix himself, he wouldn't have ideas for other people. And I was talking to you earlier about like my own chronic injuries that keep repeating myself, so I'm having to give up some stuff to focus on something else, but using that fact to energize and make better things I can do. So that's kind of because it's helpful for me and to other people. So that's kind of the same kind of similar wounded healer kind of thing. So this kind of idea of healing and therapy in the big sense. And I love this idea of Nietzsche saying philosophy as a way to health. But he means the great health, not having a sore belly. He means, proper expression of human possibilities.
Yes.
For you and for
beyond self-loathing and anxiety and guilt.
Yeah, but not hiding from those, using them. If you have those, using them and transforming them. That's where the energy comes from.
Yeah, very good. I'm trying to think, is there any other subject? I think I've probably spoken about everything I want to talk about that I can think of. Obviously, I haven't finished this book yet, but it's really good so far. I can recommend it as well. It's excellent. And I wish, again, I found it years and years ago. But as things are, thinkers like this very rarely get much of a look in, do they? Yeah. It's quite a shame, really. But it's here's
another quote from
good.
Hurst. Yes. I can't say his name properly.
Please go ahead.
The practices of re-education in ancient schools most likely also included a re-education of the body. He has body in quotes here. Because, Nietzsche's idea of the body's bigger than just a physical materials thing.
Yeah.
Since the energy for the tyranny of inner automatisms, your conditioned habits and automatic behaviors, is always taken from the body, these automatisms are also established in the body in patterns of automatic movements and postures. So in principle, the work of dissolution of these automatisms could start either at the top end, the thought structure, you're thinking, at the middle, in the emotions of the spirit, or at the bottom in the physical habits. Or it could begin by working simultaneously on all three levels. The aim would be the breaking of all automatisms of associations between thoughts, feelings, and postures. So obviously this really interested me. It actually sounds like Gurdjieff, actually. Gurdjieff talks about automatisms and working on the three levels at the same time, thinking, feeling, moving. I don't know if this guy's in relation to that, but Gurdjieff I put in the same idea as a guy with a philosophical school with practices, and practice was the main thing. He seems to have lots of, if you read the Gurdjieff stuff, there's lots of theories and kind of new age kind of stuff in the beginning, and there's a lot less of that at the end. In fact, at the end he has his own kind of mythological story and stuff. So he's like, again, but it's all what's he doing with people in the schools, and when he had people, the training and that, it's all like these one-to-one practices and then mostly one-to-one stuff. Well, things that are individualized because different people need different things at different times. But it's a school with physical place, with physical people doing work on themselves and often doing things that they don't feel like doing in the moment in order to create a sort of fiction between different parts of you to create something bigger. So Gurdjieff's doing it too. This is clearly what Nietzsche's talking about. They're not that different now. I never thought of that before, but like
Yeah.
until recently, that's
Very, very similar. Eerily similar, some may say.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they're both like they're both based on will. They're both thinking about how to have real will so that you're actually have some kind of freedom of will in a sense.
We can talk about that too. Another thing I read in this book that I really liked was that Nietzsche, apparently, according to him, he denies both notions he denies free will as being a part of Christian metaphysics of sin and punishment, which totally makes sense because the idea of free will is, as you and I know, kind of incoherent, but it only makes sense if you want to hurt someone for doing the wrong thing, right? But he says his distinction is between weak wills and strong wills, with freedom of the will functioning as a goal for someone striving to strengthen the will. Strength of the will would be the unification of all psychic forces in a line of willing constituted by a self, command, and self-obedience structure. Such structures may be oriented to freedom of the will. It would be a will to free will, something like that, which is directly in line
I love that.
with what I think. That's fucking incredible.
I should have given you the quotes to you. You read that far better than I can read it.
No.
Next time I'll send you the quotes.
The only problem is the Americans can't fucking understand a word you're talking about because every time I upload a podcast, I have to fucking do a transcript because I can't.
Be honest, the
Americans and not understanding accents.
The Americans think that we're Irish and South African anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
So like, I mean, not will to free will that's a good way of saying it because you're obviously having to start from somewhere, your body, your life, and whatever, and there's all these constraints and stuff, and you're basically just a bundle of habits on autopilot until you start working on yourself. You can kind of make space and wiggle room for a little bit more freedom of choice between things. You can get all lost in the metaphysical stuff here and just, I'm not going to do anything until I've figured out free will, but what's the point? Just do practices and you kind of, certainly seems like you can get more free will over yourself. Well, that's good enough.
Which is all that matters, is your experience and what you, testing the idea and
you can see that you made decisions that you wouldn't have normally made, or you did things that you wouldn't normally done. You're like, oh, that's interesting. You can reflect on it after and you go, well, normally I would have been a much more restricted behavior then that would have been bad for me. And I did this other thing, which I wouldn't have done normally. So these practices are doing something. And I think there is a type of free will that's possible, kind of. It's not the right word to say free will because that makes it sound like it's totally abstract and outside of everything. But I think there is a freer space you can get into sometimes. Some people probably have more of it than others. I don't know. But it's a real thing. But it doesn't just happen by itself. And you can only know it's a real thing first by realizing that you are on autopilot most of the time. And then doing something and then realizing, oh, I wasn't on autopilot now. I'm slightly less robotic. And then you just keep pulling that thread and doing things. And then eventually in the beginning, you have to trust other people saying, here's a practice that works, just do this. You might not know the saying for a while, but if you just keep going, something will happen. So you kind of have to take it on faith, or because you're just desperate, you need to change, or you're bored or in pain. And you kind of had to take on faith to begin with, and then you get some knowledge that it kind of works, and then you can keep doing it, and then you eventually you can figure out your own things. But it's usually just combining other existing things. Very rare for someone to come up with something genuinely new.
No,
Even people that looks like they did, if you trace back that they didn't.
There's always somewhere. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything, actually. Really?
Yeah, I don't think it's impossible. I think that's because the concepts are coming from someone else. These are social things.
Yeah.
And a certain life forms and certain people with certain energies and ways of behaving will integrate and combine things in genuinely new ways, but they're using something. It's like you don't invent a new food, you combine other foods and eat it.
Yeah.
You don't invent a new thing. Like you're just using stuff that's already there in a new way. So yeah, and if you look at Nietzsche, that's what he's doing. He's taking all the old ideas, and that's what he says about using the recipes, from the different schools. They're just experimental laboratories for ways of living. And you can take a recipe from one place, try it works, try one from somewhere else. You don't need to be all, oh, I'm a Stoic, I only do Stoic stuff. You don't need to be all, oh, it must be Plato stuff, Nietzsche's evil, I'm like a Christian Platonist, or,
or a Buddhist.
And you also don't need to be a Nietzsche guy. Oh, I hate Christians and Platonists, so you can't do anything like it. You can take the stuff from everywhere. Some of the best practices I've done at different points have been like Christian mystic stuff worked really well at one point for me, and other times it was like way more kind of biological, bioenergy stuff that had none of the kind of higher concepts at all, and very like materialistic, and that led to me to things that weren't materialistic experiences, So like in my own experience, or like what I've had is you can't always know where it will lead, and you don't even know what it is you need, and you don't know what it is that's good for you often. Some of it just stumble across by luck, and some of it you are given by someone else.
Yeah. I think we're the only ones saying this, by the way. Everyone else is arguing. Here's another quote. Now that I am isolated in my 41st year, that I have no disciple, and that I sense it daily, that I am now in my period of greatest strength, so as to engage in the greatest school, activity as a philosopher. Put that before your soul. Out with the books from this corner. They are my fishing rods. If they do not catch me, any humans, they have no sense. Well, that hits home. So I'm thinking, we were talking about maybe getting together a course or something, and I was, a place to go, maybe in Europe somewhere or something. And this is just motivating me to do it more. And it reminds me, I have a couple of Bulgarian spies looking up potential compounds used, because, talking through this with you, it just seems to me that the logical way to do things is to form something like that, even if it's only for a short time, is to get a retreat together in a learning center together. It just seems like
many reasons to do that. It's like you learn better, you make friends, find the others, you can go faster. Things that you maybe learn anyway, but you can go a lot faster doing it that way. And it would be good to get together something like a sort of one-off temporary get-together thing, and then see how to build from that to something more permanent. And it's like, I don't think you need like a Plato or a Nietzsche to start any of these things. I think just a bunch of guys who are working on themselves and have some practices that seem to work and want to find other people and combine them and see what we can do with it. I think it's okay. I think we're allowed to just, what is it they say now? You
can just do things.
Try it and see what happens.
You can just do things. It's incredible.
And we don't need to do the guru thing, and you don't need the fake guru thing, and you don't need to wait until you have some new philosophy to take over the world. You just need kind of three things. You just need a philosophy, and by that I mean a sort of general way of approaching life, and this what we've talked about here about self-shaping and doing practices to transform yourself in some way. You just need a kind of philosophy like that, practical philosophy. You just need practices. You need actual techniques, methods to use that have some kind of formal structure to them, so you can teach them and practice them, but aren't belief systems. They're just tools. And they needed some place to get people together to work on these things away from real life for a little while. And different people could stay longer, shorter, and then go back and do their own thing. You could give skills and techniques to people who are really successful and active in different ways, and send them on their way and make them even better than they were before. And then other people might go deep on the existing practices, or to develop their own and to train others how to do those kind of things. So the older I get, the more I'm interested in having something more permanent in a place that people can come to all year round. but it's the practical nature of that, where the money, how you find the people, that kind of thing.
Well, the biggest question I think is going to be, who's going to be the Pontifex Maximus? And I'll put my hand up for that. I want to be dictator of the school. But I don't know how you feel about that. Maybe, you're not so keen on to be the boss.
Well, okay, I'll just have to be the sort of the wee annoying guy that's flitting around and fiddling things from behind the scenes. And you could be the face of it.
Very good. I'll carry a big stick, but to speak softly, perhaps, particularly in the meditation sessions in the morning. Got to correct the posture and make sure everyone's not slouching, It requires a bit of corporal punishment, I think. Well, it's good. That's good. I just trying to think. I think, there's a whole lot of little stuff here. I'm just looking at the book at the moment and, I can't wait to read the rest of it. There's even a reference
It's
here.
not often I would like...
Yeah, sorry. Go.
It's not often I would recommend, especially spend like hours talking about a book about a thinker.
Yeah,
I would usually just recommend the book. But in this case, because it totally transforms your understanding of the thinker, and it's useful in its own terms for the inspiration it gives you, and the kind of model of, actually you can just do this. This is what people have done. And this stage in the culture, I think it's probably going to become more popular. These things are already sprouting up, variations of this. And why not?
Yeah, it's interesting. Everyone who makes fun of him always says, "Oh, you couldn't even get Lou Salome." Like he's such an incel. Like people always love to criticize him for that. But there's even a quote here where he's writing to her, and I assume a lot of this stuff just must be in German, and we just don't get it in English or something. Because it's part of the good thing about this book. It seems like a lot of it is because he's a German. He can speak German, and he's recruiting all this interesting stuff. But he's talking to her. And he's saying, I very much wish to be allowed to be your teacher, finally to tell the whole truth. I now search for human beings who could be my heirs. I carry something around with me which cannot at all be read in my books. And for all that, I search the most beautiful and fertile soil. See my selfishness. That doesn't really sound like a simp, a guy that's simping out for a girl. You know what I mean? Like a guy who is a simp isn't going to say that. Like it sounds to me like he's genuinely looking for just who aren't fucking retarded and can at least do some of this stuff.
I mean, you have to remember, even though he's presented as like a misogynist, and obviously he says some rash things about women and stuff, Nietzsche.
Well, they deserve it. I mean,
he actually isn't. Because when you actually hear about it, him and a famous scholar at the time, I forget his name, they were the people who backed the idea of letting women into the university and stuff. There was like a debate about or whatever, and they put their names to it.
Yeah, I do remember
he was like, but remember, he's like an elitist for men too. So he's like, obviously there's going to be an elite, a few women that are really good at this stuff. In the same as there's a few men. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't like...
Yeah.
It's not a
he's
mass not saying everybody.
Yeah.
He's not saying they're the same. He's not saying they're different. He's not saying anything. He's looking for the people with the potential for the self-overcoming and stuff. So
it is interesting in that quote though, how he says, I carry something around with me which cannot at all be read in my books. So it's kind of almost then saying, well, fuck.
He's clearly had the awakenings, enlightenment. That's what he's talking about. He's saying, and there's, so like anyone who's done those practices and has had awakening type experiences, to be really broad about it, you have your own little secrets and tricks that you did that you've never shared with anyone. You have your own variations and practices that aren't the ones that you were taught or the ones that you read about, your own version. You mix things together that seem to work for you, but you're like, how could I possibly explain this to somebody else? Because there's so many things involved. And it was me at this time. And even now, the things that worked for me back then wouldn't, like energetic type stuff, wouldn't at all work for me now. So how could I teach that? Because I couldn't even teach that to myself now, but it was the perfect thing for me back then. He must have had all these things and he's wanting to teach people, look, I'm not going to write about this, look, but do this thing and you'll get these weird experiences, And if you keep doing it, then these other things, insights will come and stuff. He's bound to be been doing that. Zarathustra is clearly like a ecstatic.
It's
kind
an
of
exaltation. Yeah, just stalt,
Yeah.
without a doubt. It's purely an energetic, it's like a Vedic hymn. It's got the same energy. It's like, I don't know. Like, I love it.
Yeah, there's something like
Yeah.
that's in the same category as like religious text. And
It
I
is,
know people are going to misunderstand what I'm saying here, but it's the same category, or is like it's stuff that's coming to the person in a different way. Like the pre-Socratics have this as well, the poetry of them, and some of the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus also as well. This is like coming from the depths kind of stuff. So you can say, the Christian mystics will put this to God and all that. Those older ones were putting it to a God or to whatever. And Nietzsche clearly has that kind of thing going on. It's like real poetry type stuff. It's the stuff where it comes up, the words come up, and you can't change them. You might not understand them, but you can't change them because that's how they came to you. And I get the feeling that Zarathustra does a lot like that, where it just came to him in that way, and there's no need to rewrite it and spend months rewriting it. Of course, you can do it 10 days because it came to him like that, and it's kind of offensive or almost, again, people will misunderstand this, but blasphemous to change it,
Yeah.
because that's how it came to you,
Yeah, it's the work of a prophet. It's a revelation, maybe, as opposed
It's
to
prophet behavior, for definite, yeah.
for sure.
I mean, a religious person's going to find that offensive calling a prophet, and I'm not saying, oh, this is my religion and I'm following him. But like, I don't mean that either. I mean, to me, there's thousands of prophet behavior people.
Yeah.
And some of them are really good at it, and at the right time, right place, and a big movement grows up around them, and a culture grows up around them. Other ones, it doesn't happen. They just kind of flourish in a little place. They have a little school in the garden, then they die, and their books go missing. 300 books go missing, like Epicurus, and just some fragments left, gone forever. Still worthwhile, though,
For sure.
So it doesn't need to last forever. Brian Johnson.
Very good. Good chat.
So when you start in your Twitter account, Nietzsche bra,